the policy setting agenda. Demands for environmental flows I've spoken to. There's not much else there that is of use to yourself, except the last point, the use and management of groundwater is going to be a big issue. If you're into the Great Artesian Basin, it'll be more strongly regulated and there'll be greater controls over its use and its distribution. The long-term planning horizons that are required for some of the institutional infrastructure that is about, you can see there the election cycle is only short-term, but once you start to get into long-term biodiversity and bridge design, you've really got to be thinking a long-term out. And some of the implications for that infrastructure are substantial. Rural health is an issue that you see quite markedly now, recorded in many of the hospital data sets, where there are increases in asthma and hay fever and dust-induced issues, and they'll be quite substantial. And I'm sure many of you have lost stock through the years from bad water quality and algal blooms. The blue-green algae toxicity issues are increasing quite rapidly in many of our streams, particularly further south and on the eastern areas. I want to close by talking very briefly about the business opportunities here. The three domains of implications or impact are set around those primary impacts of the biophysical changes, reflected here in temperature and precipitation and drought and wind, etc. The next level down are where the ETS system is currently sitting, so the emissions trading scheme is sitting, mandatable renewable energy targets, efficiency standards, operating codes of practice for industry. Think a little bit about those, because the third driver, the tertiary drivers, are changing consumer attitudes and values throughout the globe. You are well positioned to be very well placed to access a lot of markets into the future as a consequence of climate change if you can just continue to maintain a clean and green perspective into the future. But that will be discussed at length by other speakers. The drivers of business opportunities are evident in temperatures, demand and competition for water, sensitivity and interest in the environment. That will impact heavily on you. Changes in consumer attitudes we've spoken about in terms of their preferences. I've highlighted the carbon one down the bottom, which is going to be dealt with in subsequent speakers here today. Insurance, there's not much here for you that is of relevance in this slide, but just something to note. The asset management and redesign is an important one, and the natural resource management is another one. But on this slide you'll see things that are directly related to you, which include plant breeding and opportunities such as channel millet for the future, water use, which is really about landscape design, and I've highlighted a couple of red areas that will be spoken about by the speakers in subsequent sessions today. There are three, in fact, major business sources. The business of carbon will revolve around sources and sinks, and they can be classically split over three areas. One is about the carbon that's consumed for energy. Two is about the carbon that is stored and or lost and captured in the trees, the soils and the oceans, and the carbon that's emitted from waste and inefficiencies. If you have a look at this graph, and this is a particularly interesting graph because it goes totally against the ETS scheme that's being proposed by the government. This was a graph that was put together by a group of economists and modellers that looked at the opportunities to try and redress some of the carbon footprint. Now, I did want to spend a little bit of time on this. Whoops, where do we go back? While you can't read this axis very well, I'd expect, because of the amount of information that's captured on it, this will be available to you to look at later on. The brown up the top is fugitive emissions, then there's waste below that, losses from forestry, losses from land use, agriculture, and so then it goes into the metals engineering efficiencies and building design and vehicles, reduced use of vehicles. We drop into the green, which is the renewable energies, so the red's the vehicle usages and energy usage by industry. And these last areas are about the geothermal, wind and hydro. And this are regarded as these black bits as the non-reducible emissions that are associated with power stations and gas and coal and largely irreducible emissions. The interesting thing here is that business as usual takes you up there, but if you could address the inefficiencies, block the wastes, take on board industry best practice, adopt the latest and most innovative technologies, it's the sum of many bits. you could in fact get the CO2 concentration of the globe, this is just for Australia, same one looks at many European and American sort of economies as well, you could get it down to about that 250 parts per million, which would be more than enough for the globe to be able to accommodate and keep recycling naturally. So there are business opportunities. There are business opportunities here which we need to explore more fully. So there are some industries that are going to be positively affected by it, some negatively. But a good example are your goods cells as an example of business that can adapt. You classically look at your industry as either crops or livestock. Largely it's all livestock out here. But you have opportunities for these other domains which will be covered by other speakers later on in the session. So in conclusion, I must have done well, or close. I think you can walk out of here with a fair degree of confidence to say that the eastern seaboard of Australia is going to get significantly drier, particularly in winter, spring and early summer. So you're going to get a marked shift, which is already occurring in the rainfall pattern. The northwest and western Australia is showing strong evidence of getting wetter, and that looks like, and there is no evidence to suggest it won't continue to do so, and the impacts are in terms of stream discharge and sediment infill rates and those sorts of issues. But the increased temperature and number of extreme events are going to be significant drivers for you out here that need to be factored into your risk management. And I stress the need for taking a business model and risk management approach to manage the uncertainty that climate brings. And obviously it needs to be evaluated in that triple bottom line, but there are numerous business opportunities here. It's not all gloom and doom, it's about doing it smart and doing it a lot more efficiently, and I think we can address many of the problems we face. But just by closing, a little one-liner for you there. It was reported by Robert Correll, and he said that the Greenland ice cap is melting so quickly that it is triggering earthquakes as pieces of ice several cubic kilometres in size break off. Pretty profound statement. He went on to say, a massive acceleration of the speed at which these glaciers are moving into the sea. Ice is moving at 2 metres per hour on a front 5 kilometres long and 1,500 metres deep. Now, if that wasn't enough to convince you that climate change is real, I hope that does. Because I think that's irrefutable evidence. And just so that you know what drives that southern portion of Australia, it's a circumpolar vortex. This is a lovely picture of it, which just shows the little hub of the circle, what's happening for the southern portion of Australia. The pressure gradient is increasing and the lows are dropping below the continent and whizzing across with very strong increases in wind speed. And that's why the southern portion of Australia, which has a very different rainfall driven system, is suffering from substantial reductions in rainfall as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. Thank you, Joe. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. A most interesting array of detail in terms of impact that Bob has put together for you. And I'd like to go immediately to questions that you might have for Bob, and you'll remember that we're going to use the idea of wait for the microphone. The reason for that is so that other people can hear it. They don't miss the question and don't know what Bob's responding to. Okay, so someone like to start us off with a question for Bob?